Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and we have a very special, exciting video today. I am visiting the National Museum of Iceland, and we're going to take a look at a couple of authentic Viking age, aka approximately 1,000-year-old swords. And I have a couple of guests today who are going to help explain the historical context and the practical utility of these. So let's dive right in.
What I have prepared for you today are three examples of Viking age swords.
Okay.
That we have in our storage here. I think they're a good example of the variation, and so you get a bit of feeling for them. They are different, of course, as you can see. This one here, found in Hringsdalur in the Western Fjords, 2006, I think. Yeah, in a pagan grave there. It's type M. Okay. By the typology made by Jan Pedersen. Type M and Q are the most common swords, or Viking age swords found in Iceland. They are quite simple in form and in style and in decoration. But simple, of course you have to think about they are still swords. But simple, if you maybe compare them to the type V, which is this sword.
This is definitely more ornate.
Yeah. More style, more decoration, and there's actually more intact of the sword and its equipment associated with the sword. For example, the scabbard. There's a little bit left of the scabbard here, which is quite unique actually. Yeah. You can see some evidence of some silver linings here on the hilt. Okay. And the pommel here has been decorated as well. So this, when I was talking about simple, I was meaning, they are still swords, as I say, but this has more, scream, more luxury, more style, more decoration.
More embellished.
Yeah.
Okay. So to put these in a little bit of context for people, what approximate date would these have been made? We have them pretty well dated, thanks to the Pedersen typology. So they are all from the, let's say, 900 up till 1100. Okay, this is really the height of what people would think of as Viking Iceland.
Yeah, but still the M type and the Q type, I think it's more the later stages of the Viking Age, late 10th century, from maybe 950 till 980, something like that. Of course, this fluctuates a little bit. Can't just say that this type were only made in those times, but generally those are the date, and we get that from for example from Norway, which they have been found in large quantities. There, the cultural layers surrounding the swords are really well dated. So this is just like a puzzle, if you like.
Absolutely.
And I can say with certain accuracy that the swords are more likely to be from this period rather than others. Okay. So 950 to 1000 for these two. This could be a little bit older, this sword here, and this bears a little bit more, mark of the of being maybe from Eastern Europe or Eastern Scandinavia, Eastern Sweden, maybe the Baltic regions, and even to Kiev, for example.
It's my understanding that swords tended to be handed down often generation to generation.
Yeah.
Is there what is the possibility that, say, this one, which is a bit more embellished and fancier, is something that was brought by a settler from Norway? Or do we know if these were, obviously they were used in Iceland, they were owned in Iceland, but do we know if they were manufactured here in Iceland?
I would say it's not likely that they have been made here in Iceland. There have been some analysis on these swords, some chemical analysis on the blades, for example. Those research suggest that the swords were not made in Iceland. And in fact, we have this was a mass production in a sense, and some manufacturers were much better than the others. For example, there were known really good manufacturers or bladesmiths in Western Germany, for example, that specialized in making high quality blades for the Viking Age swords. Just to let you know that the sword is made up out of several components, if you like. You have the blade, and you have the hilt, and the hilt is made out of at least 3 parts: the nether hilt, or the nether pommel, and the upper pommel, and the grap, or the hold, and the hilt. So those are the components, and different components came from different producer.
Okay.
And I would say it would be unlikely that they have been made in Iceland, but the fun thing about archaeology is that we never actually know for sure. We only can, interpret the data that we have in front of us. But who knows? If we research those swords even better, we could actually see that maybe with the more simpler weapons, they could have been made in Iceland.
Okay.
But then I'm just, speaking a little bit out of my mind, and I don't have any real data to support this. Other than that, we know that we could produce high quality iron here. So, that is of course a little bit leap from, knowing how to produce a good quality iron into making a really good standard sword.
A sword's a complex thing to manufacture.
Yeah. So I would think that, we could have, of course, produced our own axes, for example. Quite simple. But then, of course, meaning, simple in its own term, right, in comparison with other weapons, for example. They are quite simple.
Was there any difference in different areas in Iceland with styles of weaponry or prevalence, or was this pretty much a uniform culture?
It's a little bit tricky because, first and foremost, we don't have that many swords here.
Okay.
There are only 22, I think, intact that have been found from this period. If we put that into comparison with Norway, for example, they have 3,000.
Wow. Okay.
And we have a lot more of the axes and the spear here. I think we have roughly 200 spears.
Okay.
Roughly 200 spears. And 150 or something, 150 approximately axes. That actually shows, okay, if we're gonna interpret that data, we can actually say that the swords were quite uncommon here in Iceland. People relied more on axes and spears. And then I was thinking about, when you called me, actually the main weapon was not even swords, spears, and axes. It's rock. People threw rock.
Okay.
So that was the weapon of choice, first and foremost. But I couldn't find really cool rock to show you. But instead I found these swords, and of course they are a little bit what do you say, linked to the picture that we have from that time.
Iceland was a frontier society. It was a much less rich society in terms of wealth and material goods than I expect you had on mainland Scandinavia.
Yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, in the sense, of course, the island was settled quite late. But the what do you say, the history or the myth, basically, as I would like to call it, that the country was settled by some fugitives and people fleeing from their tyrants in Scandinavia. I think it's not that simple, and I in my sense, when people were coming here, and crossing the Atlantic was a huge enterprise in itself.
Absolutely.
Really costly. And first you have to know something about the island. You can't just, I'm going, goodbye. Okay, where are we going? I'm just going out. I've seen enough of this. Okay, people knew that, there was something there. And people had actually, exploited the natural resources a little bit from certain time, maybe 100, 200 years, who knows. So when the settlement actually begins, there are wealthy chieftains in Scandinavia that that pay the price. They actually pay people to settle here, to expand their control over access of different resources, for example. So certain people were definitely rich.
Okay.
I would think so.
How does the proportion of swords to, say, spears and axes compare to a place like Norway or Sweden?
I have only the numbers of swords in Norway in my mind now, but my gut feeling is that the swords were more common in Norway rather than here. And then again, we have to think about a little bit how these swords were found here in Iceland, for example. Majority of them are found in pagan graves, dated pre-Christian, pre-1000, if you like. And a majority of them have been found by accident, nearly by some when some farmer has expanded his fields and or by some wind erosion, some bones sticking out of the ground, or some swords, for example, and people just stumble across it. It's really recently that we have begun on searching for the pagan graves systematically. It's only 20 years.
Okay.
And then we have actually found more and more graves. We have found more graves in a cluster of each other, and structure and stuff like that. So perhaps we see an increase in number of swords found, and that in fact we have found, I think, 4 or 5 last 10 years.
Okay, so that's exciting.
So in comparison, what we have found earlier, who knows how the number will end.
The heyday of Icelandic archaeology may be in the future.
Yeah, definitely.
That's very exciting.
That's really exciting.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. All right, so Reynir, your specialty is actually using weapons like this and studying how they were historically used.
Yeah.
So what are the combat characteristics of a Viking sword? There are thrusting swords, there are cutting swords. What are the particular strengths and techniques that these swords are made for?
What I intently am interested in, so the typology that is most known is Jan Pedersen, though there are many others. They deal with the sort of hilt. That is really crucial because the sword was distinguished by the hilt. Like you could know that, this person is this person because of the hilt, not of the blade. The blade is not so terribly different between them. Not enough variation for it to matter in any big way. And now this is a double-edged sword with a sort of spatula tip.
Okay.
And we had to do deep research to figure out how it was used instead of just guessing. So we see the blade, the tip is spatula, probably not for stabbing much. And then we check the literary sources, not for stabbing much. And then we check the picture sources. They're mostly raised, not like for thrusting. So we can assume, based on all sources put together, it was not a stabbing tool. It was a cutting tool.
When you're talking about literary sources,
Yes.
you mean literary sources from when these were made, 1,000-year-old.
And afterwards, everything. When we talk about literary sources, we talk about sources that talk about Vikings.
Okay.
Be that contemporary, be that domestic, be that outside the country, whatever. That's sort of our gateway there in literary sources, and we put them all together to see what it. And in the literary sources, we talk about the sagas, which are written after the Viking Age, but about Vikings. They talk about the quality of a sword being one that bítur or bites.
Okay.
So that gives us some idea. Now, the really interesting thing about the sword compared to all the other weapons is it added something new to the arsenal, and that is maneuverability. So with the other weapons, you chopped in one angle, and then you had to take it back in some way. The sword, however, had the counterweight at the end there, and the balance point closer to the handle in good swords. So you could cut, and you can twist, and you can cut in another direction. And we often say that the sword is like ballistic missile. You could sort of control ballistic missile. And it was used in many ways. It was used, for example, in Holmganga, which is duel, or invígi. There you had to have a sword. A sword was a sword, and both parties had shields. So it could not be that one person had a sword and the other had an axe. It had to be equal because they could not move. It was a round-based, immobile, combative system, really twisted. And you could also see that in the levy, you had to have a sword, the king's levy. So there are, sorry?
Now, the king's levy. I didn't think there was a king in Iceland.
No, in Scandinavia. No, in Iceland, this was the only place it was needed was dueling, Holmganga.
Okay.
Otherwise, it was just a weapon.
There really, we think like in continental Northern Europe, we think of battles between chieftains or kings. In Iceland, there weren't really any battles, were there? There were a lot of feuds and perhaps duels, but one army on one side and another army on the other?
No. There were no mass armies, and that's why we don't see archery either. We see really few arrowheads. There was no reason for it. Nothing to hunt, no wood to make the bow out of, and no mass battle where bows were mostly used. So, but feuds can turn bloody. Principle of revenge, blood revenge, and the principle of Hávamál, for example. The first one says that any door you open, look around because you don't know where the danger is. And I think it's number 38 that says never be further than one step away from weapons. This was all, everything you read about this culture is, even though they were farmers and human beings, they lived in a totally different society, that this was a necessity.
Do you have any insight into how many people in society would have owned a sword? Like how many people were potentially getting into duels as opposed to, I'm not the head of a major farm household, so I have a spear in my room, but not a fancy sword. Or was it really, this was an expense that many, many people were expected to bear that, well, if you're going to be a man and you're going to be represented, did you have to have a sword to attend the Althing? Or to partake in legal matters?
No, there is no law that I remember about sword or necessity of swords. I think if you could afford a sword, if you could attain a sword, you wanted a sword. But there are instances where you had to get a sword because there was a duel happening. And then you would maybe get a lone sword or create a ruse to get a sword for a moment. But it seems like, at least in the literary sources, that the unsuspecting sometimes had a sword. Now, this is all based on archaeology that we have to look into it, not the literary sources at this time. Like how many there are, we will just find them. We can make guesses, but other than that, the only really need for a sword, apart from just home defense or showing off or taking part in battle, is dueling.
Okay. how prevalent was dueling? It's starting to make me wonder if this was a weekly event.
Yeah. So dueling is a really interesting thing because it was it had a possibility of dealing with many situations. In most cases, dueling was just raiders. What we call Vikings today were those who raid a town or wherever, and those who dueled. And in the law codes, it's really difficult to see the difference between a dueler or a raider. And they use the same words like herja for both, and both are dangers that come from the sea. So in most cases, these duelers were just bastards. They came, knocked on your door and said, you know what, I like your wife. And you can give her or we can duel. Just like they do with raiding oftentimes. They came and took what they wanted. And, but it was also a way to, as a proxy war, so if two families were fighting, they could offer two of them to do a proxy war. And it was also, in Iceland, we didn't have police. We only had the law. And you had to deal with the justice yourself. So if the court case was not in your favor, there was the possibility of offering a duel. So how prevalent it was, I cannot tell you. I just know that it had it fit into many situations. And most of them are not nice.
Do you have any sense as to how often this was fatal, or was this more? The thing that comes to mind is lots of animals that will, two bulls will have a fight over dominance of something, and it's rarely fatal.
Yeah.
With this sort of dueling, was it expected that, whoever is clearly inferior in the duel is simply going to step back and they'll be allowed to go their way without whatever it is that the duel's over?
It seems like more often than not it was fatal. Now that doesn't mean that it was in every case, because there seems to be a protocol if it was not supposed to be fatal. You could pay something called holmlust. So I would put X amount of currency under, and you would put X amount, and if you won, you would get it all. Like I would pay you, like take it, and I'm now free and injured. But usually it was to the death.
There's a hit to your reputation, I assume, if you pay your way out of a duel.
This was all about the concept of orstir, the word glory, that your name be spoken about. So to show up to a duel is not an easy task, because it's, as I told you, it's round-based. It's a scary thing. There's a sword coming at you and it's not your turn. You could not move, so you could not move an inch, because then you could be called a nýðingur. So you could be called a nýðingur if you didn't show up, which is sort of the scornful, the most shameful in the society. If you didn't show up, you would be a nýðingur. If you moved around, you would be a nýðingur. And sort of, you'll have to win.
This is the armed equivalent of two guys standing next to each other and kicking each other in the junk until one person gives up.
Exactly. And more than that, it actually is the essence of what we think is Viking combat. It is, like with Glíma, you had to have the full power. When you attack, you give it all you have. So, because you have only one turn, and then it's the next person's turn. Second is they had 3 shields to block. So if you didn't hit the person, at least you want to break his defense, because eventually he will run out of defense. So you had to have the sort of the mindset of this drengur: show up, be there, don't give up, no matter what. You have to have this power element that we see in Glíma as well. And then you had to have this adaptability, improvisational skill, or cunning. Like, I don't know if Ármann is before me or after me, he told about rocks. They are like the we call it the king of weapons, the king of Viking weapons. That was the rock. And that shows this improvisational skills. Even a superior battle occasion was a vígi. That was a superior battle occasion because there were loose rocks there. You could run up and throw stones.
If it works, it works.
Yeah, that's how they did it. If it works, it works, as long as it you either attain your reputation or at least maintain it.
Okay. Oh, very cool. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the insight.
There you go.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed this look at something that is a little bit different. After all, it's forgotten weapons, not forgotten guns. So a huge thanks to the National Museum of Iceland and both of my guests for being willing to take the time to come on and give us some really cool historical insight into things that we normally only see in storybooks and pictures. Thanks for watching.